The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
Private sector. And I think that we collectively, as a planet, we're all a little bit surprised to see so many private sector companies providing support in a geopolitical conflict without really waiting for government to provide some guardrails around this, is the phrase that one of our next guests used when we were chatting about this yesterday. The Russian invasion of Ukraine really did activate a very important resource in a way that many of our next guests say has ushered in a new era. So what does this mean for future conflicts? It is my great pleasure at this point to welcome Kelly Bissell, who's going to be joining us, it looks like, just momentarily. Kelly is now, he's a SIG principal, and he has been for a while, huge supporter of the Cyber Initiatives Group. He's also the Global Security Services Lead at Microsoft. And Stu Solomon, who's the president of Recorded Future. And Greg Rattray, who I think I saw on there, and he will be coming back in just a moment with his real name underneath his photo. I think he came in as Matt Hayden a little bit earlier. Greg is co-founder and partner at Next Peak. And I'm also pleased to welcome my colleague, New York Times White House and National Security Correspondent David Sanger, to moderate this conversation. And I think Greg is going to dial back in just a moment, gentlemen, but I'm going to turn this over to you. David, thank you so much for taking on this. I think it's a really important topic and one we're going to learn a lot from.
Great. Well, thanks, Suzanne. Great to see you, and great to see Greg when he gets back on with us, and Kelly and Stuart. We've all been having this conversation back and forth with each other for months now, and we're glad to continue it with all of you. I think one of the most remarkable things about the Ukraine war, apart from the horror of what we've seen and the human toll that it has taken, has been what we have learned about how cyber is used in an ongoing conflict. And in many ways, it's not what we expected. If you think about what we were all saying and writing even to the weekend before the war broke out in February, I remember being out at the Munich Security Conference. I was having dinner with our friend Dmitry Alperovich, who's I think up next or up a little bit later on today. And we all were having the same conversation, which is, oh, this is going to start with massive cyber attacks that will cripple Kyiv and bring down the electric grid and bring down the communications grid and so forth. And that isn't quite what happened. There were, in fact, some remarkable cyber incidents, including a satellite system that the Ukrainian government was relying on, which came down, including some attacks on government ministries. But the early thinking was that the Russians believed that they would take the country over so quickly that they would want the infrastructure to be able to go administer it. That was one of many theories. Greg, you've shown up. We're glad to see you. You're called Matt, but you've shown up, so that's good.
Yeah, no, I've been working the naming element of GoToWebinar, but unsuccessfully. So I'm here, David.
We kind of like you as a Matt, Greg. I think it sort of fits the personality, so it'll be fine.
I'll consider that. Yep. Thanks.
So Kelly, let me start that question with you, because Microsoft did this quite remarkable report that I think was the most comprehensive thing that I've seen, at least out in the unclassified world, that sort of matched up the cyber attacks with the kinetic attacks.
Yeah, that's right. You know, Brad Smith, our vice chair, did a really good job of describing this. But if I were to summarize it, it is exactly what you said, which is we all thought in the cyber community that they would lead with cyber. But really what happened is cyber attacks were really ancillary and part of their other businesses, because we saw a bunch of attacks in Ukraine and cyber, but also other countries around the world to either distract or actually slow down, you know, other groups. So, you know, I think what we look at is or what we found is cyber was actually built into a lot of different things, mostly around disinformation and some very surgical cyber attacks towards different things, as opposed to leading with cyber in Ukraine.
So Kelly, tell us why. What are the theories about why we got this wrong?
Well, I actually think that in some ways, everyone was surprised, maybe even Russia. And that I think what happened, and from my perspective, is there was a splintering of the cyber gangs that maybe a nation state like Russia would use in the past, where they were split themselves. Some were for Ukraine and some were for Russia. And so I think that they weren't able to leverage the whole army, if you will, of cyber people like they thought they would. And as a matter of fact, there was this another level of cyber war going on under the covers that a lot of people didn't see.
So Stuart, what's your analysis of this? You've been sort of picking apart what happened here. Do you end up agreeing with the Microsoft report and its conclusions? Do you have a different take on this?
Yeah, there's two perspectives that I would offer, and I think really it's more about unpacking some of the things Kelly said than necessarily going against them. Number one, what we look at as a lack of massed cyber capability at the onset of the activity, I would actually look at as the logical convergence of the physical, the logical, and the influence ops coming together to create a singular effect on the battlefield that was purposely refined and trained versus not necessarily effective. So particularly, I always find it interesting when we talk about the fact that there wasn't a significant cyber presence, but then we turn around and say, but there was a lot of influence ops going on. Well, no, it's just one of the effects. It's just not the effect we expected in mass. So I think that's number one. Number two, we have to contemplate that some of the other cyber activities, particularly in the influence ops arena, that the Russians used, to some would argue to some degree of effect, was to make sure that this new monolithic bloc that is NATO all coming together to agree on a point was actually focused not on creating a physical combat scenario to force the Russians to the table, but to look at it differently. So the influence operation was in fact against NATO, the NATO bloc itself. It was against the populace supporting NATO inclusion or exclusion of certain countries at certain times, and getting the popular vote behind them in all these other NATO countries was equally a cyber effect that the Russians used. We could argue how effectively or not. The other thing to think about, and I love the point that Kelly brings up around the cyber gangs, because there's a reality between nation state sponsorship and nation state acquiescence when it comes to cyber effects emanating from one country to another. And I think we saw pretty clearly that the criminal-minded cyber gangs happen to have a little bit of hacktivist mindset in their thinking as well. In other words, they really rallied around social causes as much as economic causes. And because the Russian government had presumably refocused its concentration away from the control of those groups, you saw the splintering effect that we did. So I think that there are a number of scenarios here to think about.
So let me ask you another way at this, which is, until that time, until the war broke out, we had been all dealing with cyber as a short of war weapon, right? Best in the gray zone. Suddenly we're using it in the midst of a kinetic war. And somebody thinks about the question of, okay, how do I take out the power grid? Well, I could write a lot of code and hope they haven't protected themselves better than they did in 2015 and 2016 when they were easy to get at. Or I could just, aim one shell at the substation and blow it to smithereens, which seems easier and faster. Is that what happened?
I would argue it's a third component, because, and I think the way you framed your original question of leave infrastructure behind so that when we occupy, we have something useful rather than a rebuild scenario. But I would argue that just the threat of doing that in and of itself could destabilize popular support of the incumbent government. So by having that at their fingertip to be able to state at any given time, we can turn off the lights. At any given time, we can mess with the nuclear infrastructure. That's thought to be an influence operation unto itself, which could be used for later effect.
So Greg, I'm interested in your thinking about this question, about why we got this wrong and what we saw differently. But let's not conduct this conversation as if the Russians were the only cyber actors here, right? The Ukrainians turned out to be not bad. In fact, pretty damn good. So what did we learn about what the Ukrainians did on the defense side, where I know you've been working to help them a lot? And what did we learn from what they've done on the offense side, which no one in the US government seems to want to get out and discuss?
Yeah, there's a lot in that, David, but it's a nice segue, in terms of why we were sort of surprised at how the cyber conflict evolved, right? And I agree, and sort of building on, Kelly and Stuart's remarks. I think, there was the issue of the Russians decided, to do less sort of disruptive infrastructure-based attacks for reasons that have been explained. I think there's also an issue that I would term a little bit different, but that Kelly and Stu brought up, which is using cyber gangs to do synchronized military operations. I think they got surprised by the lack of operational art they had to use their cyber attack capabilities in a highly orchestrated way, whether synchronized with military operations or to just achieve, communications disruptions or sort of pure cyber things. I think the Russians have, my assessment, is much less operational art for these military cyber operations than maybe we expected them to have, given that we thought they were pretty sophisticated from an APT perspective, right? So that espionage might be different than what we're talking about here. And then there's the question you raised about the Ukrainians and their ability to handle these things. I've read this with great interest. And many know that I've organized, sort of a collaborative for assistance, and have been working with the Ukrainians at the National Security and Defense Council and their National Cyber Coordination Center, via them, the CERT, and as well as some public-private partnerships. I'm a little concerned that we're too sanguine about the Ukrainian defensive capability. I think what they've become very good at, which they've shown in other areas, is agility on recovery, right? And a willingness to fix things, when they're broken quickly, to adopt new elements. One thing I think that the Microsoft report is crucial about is helping them move to cloud-based solutions for just performing technology digital functions, as well as to create defensive capability around those digital functions. And they've done that, which is even contrary to their own rule sets inside the country. And we're in those discussions sometimes with them about what sort of assistance.
Moving out of the country, right? I mean, they're in the cloud somewhere. Right. Where they think the Russians would be hesitant to go attack because it might be a NATO nation, for example.
Yeah, well, yeah, right. They're in the cloud, and the servers are not on-prem or in data centers, right? So again, if the Russians wanted to knock out communications and everything for an ISP is in a data center, or even a critical infrastructure company, it's a lot easier to do that with physical effects than it is if the services are cloud-based. And in both the Ukrainians themselves and the Western assisters can help through cloud provision services, right? As well as, I think defensively, it's proving already a lot easier to give them shields around those cloud-based operating systems than it is to try to deploy security systems on-prem inside Ukrainian organizations in the chaos of a war. So those things said, I think the Ukrainians have proven themselves pretty good under pressure in cyber of being able to recover different services and produce cyber defenses. The point I encourage everybody not to get too sanguine about is the maturity of their security operations and the types of things they have, which we expect in terms of SOCs and monitoring and ability to detect attacks. The organizations involved have done a lot to give them information to protect themselves, and I think that's going to be essential. And I think we've got work to do with them to improve their security operations capabilities.
And let me press you on one more part about the Ukrainian offensive operations. So they're attacking targets that deal with the Russian military, and they're attacking some targets that you might consider either dual use or civilian. What are we learning about the Ukrainian role in helping set norms of how we use cyber offensively by what they're targeting? But be an interesting question when we hear from our Ukrainian colleagues in a few minutes.
Yeah, I would think you might get a set of different answers from different Ukrainian people, but one thing you'll get consistently is we're at war and we are going to do whatever we need to do to defend ourselves, right? So that includes, generating a volunteer IT army and going after cyber targets in Russia, and even, global companies continuing to do business in Russia, right? So to your question, David, that sort of activity, is outside what we would consider, the norms that have been set generally. And, when, the activities I've been involved in, we've had to be very clear that the private sector assisting the Ukraine is on cyber defense, right? That the efforts are very focused on giving them the capability to stop attacks and not involved with, their ability to go, particularly in using sort of a volunteer force to go launch attacks, which would be outside, the norms that we hope, that everybody follows. So we, my discussions have been, you should be careful about, the long-term impact of, sort of undisciplined offensive activity in terms of, the global community's desire to help you, make sure that the digital environment in general is not threatened by the conflict.
So Kelly, let me turn to you on that topic, because one of the other points that Microsoft has made in the report is that as a corporation, it has given, what was it, $260 million basically in services. I may have that number a little bit off. You can feel free to correct me. Obviously, it's been on the defensive side, but I'm interested whether in Microsoft foreign policy, you say to the Ukrainians, look, we're willing to help you with defense, but just like you're not allowed to go use American supplied missiles to strike at Moscow and get into an escalation, you're not allowed to use resources that we're helping you with here to do offensive action of a kind that we may not approve of.
Well, look, I'll tell you that is exactly what we talked about just a little bit earlier, which is how do we move all the assets to a cloud so it's actually resilient and not on-prem that is subject to, kinetic destruction. But all of our tools are also defensive tools. They're not offensive tools. So it's going to be difficult for them to use Microsoft or any other tools for offense purposes. The third thing I think is really important that we don't need to miss is this correlation of the willing, which is a little different in this Ukrainian conflict than maybe years past. And that, I love that Stu's team is in. I know what Greg has pulled together, Microsoft, Google, Mandiant, a bunch of really the private sector to really create protections, and not offensive again, but protections for, in this case, this Ukrainian conflict.
So can you imagine, question for both you, Kelly, and for Stuart, can you imagine another situation in which the defense of a country in wartime is largely falling to the private sector?
Maybe I'll start with this. I think one of our lessons learned is in times of past, it was one military using, rifles and pistols and so forth against another military. But the old saying is, every company is an IT company. Well, every military is an IT company right now. So actually, I think the future is that this core infrastructure of IT providers like Microsoft and Recorded Future and others, we're sort of tools in this trade. And again, they're not offensive tools, but you almost can't pull those apart from future conflict. And I think that what a bunch of countries around the world are watching and learning is, wait a minute, how do I learn from this Ukrainian conflict and actually move my digital assets, if you will, to the cloud faster, that's more secure? So God forbid anything happen in that environment of critical infrastructure in that particular country, they're actually safer. And I think that's a big movement that we're seeing right now.
So Stuart, if you were, it'd be interesting your answer to that question, but just to pick up on Kelly's point, if you were, say, the chief digital officer of, just to pick a place out of the, out of the cloud, Taiwan, for example, what might you learn from this?
So first of all, I think Kelly's answer is a remarkably important one. Let's start with the world is digital, right? Our data, our machines, our weapon platforms, our communication, our logistics, our command and control, everything is digital, and everything generally has connectivity to maintain that digital presence and that digital advantage that we've created. So actually thinking about these things more in terms of an enterprise security capability, basic segmentation, knowledge of indicators of compromise, and ability to harness what normal looks like, what behavioral anomalies look like, all of those things that are so foundational to the other part of your question, our critical infrastructure, which we regulate, which we create baselines and standards for, and which we then enforce, we seem not to necessarily do to the same level of rigor in the battlefield. Now, having said that, what I would offer is that it's extremely analogous, regardless of the country, where you know that there's still going to be the same basic effects, right? Denial, destruction, degradation, disruption, disinformation, all of the different components to affect a technical environment that we all try to do are also going to happen regardless if you're in Taiwan, whether you're in Albania, or whether you're in Ukraine, or whether you're in the US critical infrastructure. And that's going to require solutions to problems that we've all been fixing as a private industry and society. So I'd rather than say that it's falling on the hands of or in the laps of private industry to solve for, I would argue that the problem is one that we've all been trying to solve for years, and now we're just applying it to a new domain, which happens to be the battlefield.
Stuart, let me ask the question another way to make it a little more Taiwan specific. If you were suddenly picked up and given that chief digital or CISO job for Taiwan, and you had to set here's what we need to do in the next 12 months, based on what we've learned in Ukraine and elsewhere, what would be on your list?
So right off the bat, I would do what I would consider to be a threat modeling exercise to look for critical nodes that have the higher propensity to be able to create an impact I don't want. In the case of Taiwan, I would start off with, how do I maintain communication and command and control of my forces in the field and connectivity with the global environment, and create a perception and reality of stability in my populace. If I could maintain those three things up front, then I need to look at the critical systems and capabilities that would lead to that, and the vulnerabilities that could be exploited to break those down. That's where I would start.
David, if I could offer maybe an option here. If I were any country's CISO or digital officer, the first thing I would want to understand is, where's my critical infrastructure and where are the points of failure in those things? There are only a few elements that might take it down a banking system or the healthcare system or automotive. And then I would actually create this digital environment and make our private sector's jobs easier, if you will, by driving a more standard security platform. So the idea, just for everybody that's listening, most CISOs in a particular company have to buy 60, 70, 80, 120 different security tools and knit them together. That actually creates risk. And so if you can move to a cyber platform that's a little bit more unified and actually use threat intelligence. Now, this is really important from Recorded Future and Microsoft and Google to actually understand where attacks are coming before they actually get there. Then you can defend a country a little bit better. And this is where the private sector and the critical infrastructure sector has to work almost seamlessly, like in each other's sock, so that we can actually deliver a safe environment. So move to the cloud, move on, in my case, Microsoft, platform, use other capabilities that Microsoft doesn't do to actually create a more simple, unified platform to make the country safer. That's what we got to do.
Yeah, Dave, just to build a bit on that, I mean, just to recognize, like, Taiwan's actually fairly technologically sophisticated, but if you think about other environments, we'll have to do this, like the Philippines, right? There's just, recognizing that we're going to have to help, if you were in that role, getting more modern and, maybe leapfrogging into cloud we keep coming back to, but to this platform will be a big element. But the other thing that we haven't talked much about is just, having the right authorities in place and in being, as a chief digital officer or a CISO, the ability to help make, sort of coherent migration occur. Because in a lot of these places, there is a lot of debate about who's in charge and who has the authority to make these, investments or changes happen, or even bring in assistance efforts. So there's sort of an element of just rationalization of governance at the level you're talking about.
Greg, you and I have been at various meetings where you've heard companies that have pulled out of Russia or aided the Ukrainians make the case that, hey, look, this was a sacrifice, it was a big urgent issue, but at the end of the day, Russia was, I remember one corporate executive telling us, 2% of the company's revenues. You don't want to lose 2% of revenues, but it's not going to change your business strategy if you do.
Right.
If there was a Taiwan incident and suddenly one had to try to organize the American business community, or the Americans, the Europeans, and others, a lot of Asian multinationals as well, to do roughly the same thing we've done with Russia isolated, it'd be a really different calculation. Suddenly you're talking about 30% of revenues, 40% of revenues, and huge amounts of supply chain for the company. We don't buy a lot from the Russians. Tell me how you think that would play out differently.
I think it's going to evolve a lot. If that happens now versus a year from now versus 3 years from now, I think one of the things for everyone to watch is just how the technological decoupling with China is occurring is changing all the things you just said, right? We are becoming less supply chain dependent on China. In certain industries, they also are consciously already choosing to do less business in China because of the nature of our national security policy. But I think that's very, like, if you just take I've done a little work in this area. If you take the technology industry, which is largely already decoupled, Microsoft has taken an interesting long-term strategy. I've been to the Microsoft Center in Beijing, where you show the Chinese the code and you keep operating. But in general, our technology and cybersecurity industries are already not engaged, right? So they would lose little. But you take the automotive industry, heavily engaged there, right? So, in making choices about using Chinese technology versus US technology to operate. So I think the choices of US industry will be highly dependent on sort of where their exposure is, as this, degree of intersections of, sometimes it's the technosphere, word is using, how technologically and business dependent are you, as well as supply chain. The related factor is, in the Ukraine, we are consciously, sort of not in the war, or, like with Taiwan, there could be national security directives that make it clear, either, from the Chinese government about US companies, or the US government to US companies, about how you are supposed to behave in a conflict, which we haven't seen much of prescription by the government on in the Ukraine situation, because, as you noted, it's been relatively straightforward, I think, for most to decide where to line up and do the right thing.
Right. And it would be more complicated if it was something short of an invasion of Taiwan,
right?
But instead the slow squeeze, which, isn't really going to directly, openly violate every UN, norm created since the end of World War I. Let me just try one last more global thought on each of you, and then I want to open this up to discussion, and Suzanne can tell everybody how to go raise their hand here. Going into the Ukraine war, we were already worried about the partitioning of the internet, a sort of controlled internet on the Chinese-Russian model and a freer, chaotic, lots of illegal activity, lots of undesirable activity, but essentially a free internet in the West. How has the Ukraine war changed that, accelerated it? I'm thinking specifically of how the Russians move so quickly to disconnect people who were in the south and the east, where the fighting's underway now, from Ukrainian servers and put them instead in the RU world. Kelly?
Look, this is a complicated thing, and what I would call it splinternet, and I think it has accelerated countries thinking about internet sovereignty, if you will, and I do think that we have to have those defensive borders, if you will, because it's not a physical border, but it's an internet border that all of our companies in each country rely on. And so I think that in this race to get into the cloud, that sovereignty of the internet or the cloud is also part of that planning process. And that's where we are right now with basically most countries thinking about that.
Stuart?
In my mind, it actually harkens back to a point that Greg made earlier around when you create an environment to galvanize the populace to start to do things that are traditionally controlled by government or military apparatus, and then you walk away. So you've kind of said it's the Wild West, and now there's no sheriff in town anymore. I think the aftermath of that will actually drive to even greater debate about the openness and access than during this conflict itself, because we'll start to see a lot of really, really bad behaviors by people who before didn't either have the access or the means to act badly.
What do you think, Greg?
You know, I think I'll just go back to the point we've been driving at, which is a tension between, you know, what has been, I think Kelly mentioned it, you know, an increasing splinter net and in nations' desire to control data and, you know, in networks at a national sovereignty level, which has occurred in Russia and China, but is in other countries around the globe too, for sure. You know, which impedes the ability to deliver global services, whether they're IT services or financial services. But as we think now about one of the implications of the conflict is you're more resilient if you're not dependent on everything operating inside your country, especially if you're at physical risk like we have in the Ukraine. So I think countries will have to look at whether, if they really worry about their digital sovereignty and inability to operate, do they want it all driven by national rules and regulations where it all has to be at home, right? And I think that's a tension this conflict is really going to bring forward over time, especially for the cybersecurity community, where, you know, we're often have been in the last 5 or 6 years trying to set up things in national enclaves, but now we're learning that there's, you know, that could be dangerous in terms of resiliency in these situations, right? So that's one of the big lessons I'm taking away from what I've learned so far in the first 6 months of this conflict.
You know, the sovereignty also raises one other big issue, and I see Suzanne there, so we'll go to others, but I'll just plant this with you, a point that's made sometimes by Mary Brooks at the R Street Institute, who works with me on a lot of these cyber issues, which is this was an easy case because there was a very clear act of aggression. But supposing you had a moment where corporate America wasn't so certain that the US was on the right side of the conflict. I mean, imagine that we had had cyber during the Vietnam War, a war that deeply divided Americans about whether we should even go be involved. That would be a much harder call for everyone. Kelly, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think about this a lot. And some of this is actually in your previous book, The Perfect Weapon, in that we've seen these conflicts from nation states to companies for years, decades even, if you will, since the internet was born. But I think, and if you look at Ukraine, if you look at Anonymous and what they were doing, basically telling about 40 companies who operated in Russia to get out or will attack you, what happens if we had a sort of Vietnam, if you will, and what would other hackers do, this hacktivists? And I think that's something to factor into our equation. Or how do we, what is the responsible AI? What is responsible for each company and our countries? And this is really highlighting the problem that we've been thinking about for 40 years.
And frankly, this goes back to the much bigger discussion that we're having underlying this one, which is who has the authority to attack and with what level of legitimacy at a given time, and obviously what constitutes that attack in the first place. So as we start to talk about that, I think that the norms and expectations have broken down substantially because legitimate governments have removed those constraints.
It's pretty remarkable. We walked into this, Stuart, with the thought that we were on the way to building international norms, and where I'm coming out from the conversation with all of you is in the past 6 months, we have seen those norms even more eroded. So on that happy note, Suzanne, I'm going to ask you to go see what our audience has to ask.
Well, it may be one thing to the silver lining. I actually have seen a bunch of companies come together for the good, for the protection. And I think we have to sort of celebrate that, because otherwise, it is doom and gloom, to your point, David.
I do think, I've been taking notes like through this entire session because I think there are so many great points that have been made. And Kelly, one of the things that you said is that, the private sector has these tools available. Why wouldn't you want them in the toolbox? But I think that, the difficult thing now to navigate is, well, if the US government, whose toolbox is it, right? Does it belong to the US government and they're going to coordinate this, or does each individual toolbox belong to the companies? But there is the basic question of why wouldn't you use them? So I think we're going to have a graduated series of conversations on this issue to figure out where we all fall on it.
Suzanne, it's really interesting though on that point. Just a quick aside to be a little bit controversial. We wouldn't be having that conversation if it was kinetic warfare. So, there are established norms, there are specific guidelines for foreign military sales and weapon sales and placing weapons with certain levels of constraint onto the foreign battlefields. Yet for some reason we lose our mind with cyber because we just haven't sat down to try to figure out what those norms should look like.
Yeah, and in building on Stuart's, there needs to be a development of policy around cyber defense assistance, right? Like we're ad hocing it, and the private sector has come together, providing assistance, with good guardrails on it. But it is in the absence of, governments have supported cyber capacity building, including in the Ukraine, for a long time. That's different than what is the rule set and how does public-private partnership work when you're trying to help somebody defend themselves against nation-state attacks, right? So, again, no one really anticipated it this way, but there's an important national security, public-private, discussion around how to enable good cyber defense assistance, because I don't think this will be the last situation. Again, David's talked about Taiwan as another scenario. There's good 5 to 8 other ones that are worth being ready for in advance, and it would be good to work on that together.
Yeah, and we're going to be, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
I think we're right. There's always going to be future conflicts. But I wonder, if I were at a nation state, I would be watching this in a big way, and I might actually be a little bit more hesitant next time to invade a country, if you will, because of the global response. And I think that's at least part of the factor of equation of what do I do. And so we actually might find that the future brings a little bit more stability than more chaos, but we shall see.
It seems like chaos always comes first, and then we get the stability. We do have a question here, and I think it does. It's a different kind of aspect of what we've been talking about. But Stephen Shapiro says, with respect to all the private entities that acted on their own, either to shun Russia and/or help Ukraine, it would be great to learn what motivated them. And I think that's kind of another way of asking the question that David asked earlier. If it happened in Taiwan, what would be different? I think at the core of it, it's the motivation. How are you thinking about that? And Stuart, maybe start with you. And your company, was involved. What was the motivation?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think that there was an overt decision to apply this almost this global concept of an attack on Western values and their allies. And this was perceived to be an attack on the Western value of stability across the whole of Europe. And by the way, by implication, the Ukrainians were being attacked by a larger force that didn't necessarily have a legitimate right to do so. I think that, coupled with the fact that Russia is perceived to, certainly in the cyberspace world, to be of an adversarial nature in general, I think led to a confluence of events that made it easier to support than not.
So it goes beyond really, it's not really patriotism, it's really supporting Western values. Kelly, would you agree?
Yeah, I think that it's sort of that, I fall that into what's the right thing to support a bad actor. And really, that's what it comes down to. Stuart said it much better than I am.
And then Greg, where do we go from here? I mean, you spend a lot of your time and energy and effort sort of collectively thinking about a framework for the future. Where do you see this going?
I sort of already prefaced that with, I do think we have to sort out how we organize ourselves, both in the private sector but also with the government. I've had this notion in the work I'm doing of just more coherent blue force tracking. Like, there are a lot of entities doing a lot of different things in the Ukraine. I am pretty certain that we don't have one sort of well-developed orchestration would even be too strong. Like, we don't even have a good cognizance of where all the blue force actors, private sector, government, but also a lot of governments obviously helping in Europe and the EU itself. Like, just, we would be more effective, if we did, in a situation where we decide to help, if we coalesced a little more strongly and put the energy, into that. So that's probably, sort of thing one. The other, element, and this really just stems from the day-to-day work of trying to give the Ukrainians, the right sort of situational awareness and defensive capabilities, is you've got to build trust relationships and you've got to know the actor you're assisting. I mean, this is, so you could do that proactively in some of these situations and be ready, if, the balloon goes up, to use that phrase, to be able to bring things to bear faster. Again, some environments will be easier than others, but, knowing the players, knowing how their bureaucracy works, knowing the roles of the public sector versus the private sector. Americans tend to think that it's, the number of conversations I've had about, oh, well, we gave this to a single entity in the other side. Of course, they all know about it. Well, that's not necessarily the case, right? So just sort of organizing in advance with the assisted party is also something I think we could put energy into in the situations that are important.
Yeah, gentlemen, we are coming up on the end of the session, unfortunately, and I think this is fantastic. I just want to let people know that we will be transcribing and publishing a print version of this conversation as well. I think there are a lot of rich lessons to pick up and move forward this conversation that's happened over the last hour. But let me come to each of you quickly, if you don't mind, for just some closing thoughts. And David, if it's okay, can I turn the tables on you? I'd like to kind of hear your closing thoughts on this after you've sort of sat through this conversation over the last 45 minutes.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I want to thank Stuart and Kelly and Greg under his Matt alias for their insights here. I think we have three categories of issues to go struggle with that come out of this. Number one is the question of, is the corporate action that we have seen in this war replicable and scalable? And we don't know the answer to that, because the moral imperative of this war was so clear that there wasn't a lot of boardroom time where, Kelly and Brad Smith and others were sitting around saying, well, do we want to really come down on the side of the Ukrainians or the Russians, or just stay out of it and keep our head down? I mean, this one was easy. And so the good news about that is it created that unity that Kelly described. The bad news about that is not every future conflict's going to be this clear cut. The second big question comes out of the point that
I think we're good.
Yeah, I think he froze up for a moment. Let's give him a second. Maybe some interference.
Because I'm super eager to hear the second point.
Yeah, exactly.
Give it just a quick second here.
All right.
All right. Well, we may need to wrap. There may have been some interference, and we're going to have to just wait for that second point. Gentlemen, I really want to thank all of you so much for this conversation. I think it's a really important one to have as we navigate sort of where we are in a new digital world, which we mentioned off the top, and how we're going to respond, as David was just talking about, to future conflicts together. So thank you all so much for being here. Stuart Solomon is a SIG principal, I'm proud to say, and he's also president of Recorded Future. Kelly Bissell, also a SIG principal and Global Security Services lead now at Microsoft. And Greg Rattray, co-founder and partner of NextPeak. Thank you, gentlemen. Really